November 9th, 1989 never happened. The crowds never gathered at Checkpoint Charlie. The hammers and chisels stayed in toolboxes. The champagne remained corked. Imagine a world where the Berlin Wall, that 96-mile scar of concrete and barbed wire, still stands today, 35 years after it should have fallen. Where East and West Berlin remain separate cities, divided not just by ideology, but by watchtowers, armed guards, and the ever-present threat of death for those who dare to cross. This isn't science fiction. This is alternate history's darkest timeline. A Europe that never healed, a Cold War that never ended, and a generation born into permanent division. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand the fragile nature of freedom itself. Because in this timeline, the Iron Curtain didn't fall, it became permanent. To understand what never happened, we must first revisit what should have been. By autumn 1989, the Eastern Bloc was crumbling. On August 19th, the Pan-European picnic opened a hole in the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary. Thousands of East Germans flooded through, testing whether Soviet tanks would roll as they had in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had changed the calculus. The Soviet Union was bankrupt, exhausted, unwilling to enforce its empire with blood anymore. In our timeline, this led to that miraculous night in November when confused border guards, overwhelmed by crowds and contradictory orders, simply opened the gates. But what if Gorbachev had been ousted 6 months earlier? What if hardliners in Moscow had staged a successful coup in spring 1989, installing a leader determined to preserve Soviet power at any cost? The border guards receive different orders, the tanks roll into position, and the wall stays standing. In this darker timeline, the new Soviet leadership makes an example of Berlin. On what would have been November 9th, 1989, East German security forces, backed by Soviet special forces, violently disperse the crowds gathering at the wall. Tear gas fills the streets. Water cannons blast protesters off their feet. And when that's not enough, shots ring out. Dozens fall. The world watches in horror as the Tiananmen Square massacre replays itself in the heart of Europe just 5 months later. Western leaders condemn the violence, but what can they do? Risk nuclear war over Berlin? NATO holds emergency sessions. Sanctions are debated, but the uncomfortable truth emerges. The West isn't willing to fight for a divided Germany. The Soviet hardliners have called democracy's bluff. Within weeks, the brief window of hope slams shut across Eastern Europe. Hungary closes its Austrian border again. Poland's solidarity movement is crushed. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution never begins. The dominoes that were falling stop and begin to stack back up. By 1995, in this alternate timeline, Europe remains decisively split. The German Democratic Republic enters its 4th decade, now under a new generation of hardline leadership trained in Moscow and Beijing. East Berlin becomes a showcase of socialism with Chinese characteristics, economic reforms that create wealth for the party elite while maintaining totalitarian control. West Berlin, surrounded by hostile territory, transforms into a Cold War museum, a capitalist island sustained by massive NATO subsidies. The airlift corridors that once saved the city in 1948 now carry its economic lifeblood. But here's where it gets truly dystopian. The division normalizes. Children born in 1990 know nothing else. In East Berlin, they grow up learning that the wall protects them from Western decadence and fascist revival. In West Berlin, they grow up in a permanent state of siege, where the wall is simply part of the landscape, like the Spree River or the Brandenburg Gate. Two cities, same name, utterly alien to each other. Without reunification, Germany never becomes Europe's undisputed economic powerhouse. West Germany, burdened by the costs of maintaining West Berlin and housing millions of refugees who escaped before the final crackdown, experiences slow, grinding stagnation through the 1990s. The anticipated peace dividend after the Cold War never materializes because the Cold War never ends. defense spending remains at Reagan-era levels. Meanwhile, East Germany, learning from China's model, becomes a manufacturing hub for European companies willing to ignore human rights for cheap labor. By 2000, foreign investment pours into the GDR, not to promote democracy, but to exploit it. Nike manufactures shoes in Leipzig. Volkswagen builds engines in Dresden using workers who earn a tenth of their Western counterparts and have no right to strike. The European Union, which expanded east in our timeline, never does so here. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia remain firmly in the Soviet economic sphere, creating a permanent economic iron curtain. Perhaps most tragically, German culture itself fractures. Language begins to diverge. East German develops distinct vocabulary influenced by Russian and Chinese, while West German absorbs English at an accelerating rate. By 2010, young people from each side can barely understand each other's slang. Music, film, literature all diverge along ideological lines. West Berlin becomes a cultural powerhouse, the European center of underground art, techno music, and radical political movements, a city defined by its resistance to the wall. East Berlin develops its own cultural identity, producing state-approved art that glorifies collective achievement, while underground Samizdat movements circulate banned Western media on encrypted networks. Family reunifications, which should have happened in 1990, never occur. Millions live their entire lives separated from parents, children, siblings by nothing more than concrete and political will. The human cost is incalculable. There are families where a grandmother in the East has never met her grandchildren in the West, never held them, never heard their voices except through rare, monitored phone calls. As the 21st century dawns, the permanent Cold War drives different technological priorities. Without the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow maintains its space program, viewing it as essential to national prestige. By 2015, Russia and China jointly operate a permanent lunar base, while the United States struggles to match their achievements with a NASA crippled by decades of budget battles. But the real divergence happens in surveillance technology. The GDR, learning from China's social credit system and America's post-9/11 security state, creates the most sophisticated population control infrastructure in human history. Every East German has a digital profile tracking their movements, purchases, relationships, and online activity. The Stasi never disappeared, they just upgraded. Facial recognition cameras at every intersection. AI systems that predict dissent before it happens. And here's the most chilling part: Western tech companies helped build it. Silicon Valley exports the tools of oppression, just as they have in our timeline, but here there's no pretense of promoting democracy. It's purely transactional. But no system lasts forever. By 2024, in this alternate present, cracks appear in the permanent Cold War. Climate change doesn't respect ideological boundaries. Refugee crises from the collapsing global South overwhelm both East and West. Economic inequality within the West reaches breaking point without the cautionary tale of communism's collapse to moderate capitalism's excesses. And in the East, a new generation connected to global networks through VPNs and encrypted apps sees through the propaganda. They don't remember the crackdown of 1989. They only know they're trapped. In May 2024, a climate protest in Leipzig turns into something larger. Then Dresden, then East Berlin itself. But this time, it's different. The protesters have studied history. They know what happened to their parents' generation. They come prepared for violence. The state responds with its full technological arsenal. Drones, facial recognition arrests, families disappeared. But each crackdown creates more martyrs. The question hanging over this alternate 2024, is this finally the moment? Or will the wall stand for another 35 years? Let's step back and analyze what this alternate timeline reveals. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't inevitable. It required specific circumstances aligning in a narrow window of time. Gorbachev's weakness, not strength. Soviet bankruptcy. The moral exhaustion of maintaining an empire. Remove any one of these factors, and history pivots. In our timeline, the wall's fall triggered the end of history optimism that defined the 1990s. Democracy seemed destined to triumph. Markets would bring prosperity. The European Union would expand. The peace dividend would be invested in human flourishing. We know now that optimism was naive, that liberal democracy faces its own crises. But this alternate timeline shows something worse. A world where authoritarianism never had to adapt, where surveillance technology met totalitarian ideology without the interruption of 1989-1991. In this darker world, Berlin remains the front line, the permanent monument to humanity's failure to overcome division. The wall doesn't just divide a city, it divides human possibility itself. So what does this alternate history teach us about our actual world? That walls, once built, develop their own momentum, their own constituencies who benefit from division. That surveillance technology and authoritarian power create feedback loops that are extraordinarily difficult to break. That the window for peaceful change can slam shut faster than we imagine possible. In our timeline, we celebrate November 9th, 1989, as the triumph of people power over tyranny. But we forget how close it came to going differently, how many variables had to align, how much depended on the courage of ordinary people willing to risk everything for freedom they might never enjoy. The Berlin Wall fell, but the walls we're building today, between nations, between classes, between realities, may prove more durable, because they're not made of concrete. They're made of algorithms, of fear, of manufactured division. And those walls don't need barbed wire to be just as deadly. The question isn't whether the Berlin Wall could have stayed standing. The question is, what walls are we building right now that our children will be trapped behind?